going in this session with a focus on my favorite people to talk about, students, and specifically the pandemic's effect on students. Next slide, please. This is obviously a huge topic. The effects are broad and deep in ways that feel impossible to fully comprehend still. So we'll start by grounding our conversations in some powerful pandemic era insights. And then we'll use those insights to pivot toward the future and talk with our panelists about the questions we must be ready to address in order to make the most of this moment, this unprecedented moment to disrupt systems of inequalities and inequities within our schools. For you, throughout the session, we strongly encourage active engagement, both in the chat and through the Q&A, as was similar in the morning session. In the chat, we'd especially appreciate your own thoughts on implications and the research questions we should be looking at as we look forward. These insights, the insights you share in the chat and then captures from the Q&A, will sit alongside the conversation happening on screen and contribute to the summary reflections and themes that will come out following the event as a recap. Next slide. So let's dive right in. First, we'll hear from Tareena Musaddiq and Andrew Bacher Hicks. Tareena is a postdoctoral research fellow with the Education Policy Initiative at the University of Michigan. She uses both experimental and quasi-experimental quantitative methods to evaluate the causal impact of policies on K-12 schools and early childhood education. And she's joined by Andrew Bacher Hicks, who is an assistant professor in the BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. He studies K-12 education policy in the United States with a focus on teacher labor markets, school discipline, and the link between crime and education. As you'll hear, this collaboration leveraged state-specific data from Michigan alongside national data to identify larger themes in the findings as parents and caregivers made choices, hard choices, about where and when to send their students to school last year during the pandemic. So Tareena and Andrew, kick us off.
Thanks for the introduction, Heather, and thank you everyone for joining in. Good morning. Next slide, please, Heather. So in March of 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, most public schools in the US switched to remote learning and remained closed for in-person instruction for the remaining of that academic year. In fall of 2020, however, when schools were to reopen after the summer break for the next academic year, they had to choose between opening up for in-person instruction, staying remote, or offering some sort of hybrid instruction. And what we saw was that across US and even within states, there was a lot of variation in the mode of instruction that schools and school districts chose to offer for students. We also saw a lot of variation in public opinion on whether families thought it was safe to send their kids back for in-person instruction or not. And with this background, it's important to understand how these choices would relate to the demand for public school. The big research question that answer in our study is twofold. First, how big is this exit from the public school system? And second, are there differences in exit rates by student demographics, by grade, and by modality of instruction that the schools chose to offer? To answer this question, we use two data sources. We use detailed administrative data on student records from the state of Michigan that allows us to follow students over time. And for the big national picture, we use data from the Household Pulse Survey. Next slide, please. We find that public school enrollment declined substantially during the pandemic. In the graph here that you see, we're showing that public school enrollment in Michigan on average for K through 12 schools decreased by around 3%. But in the red line that you see here, you'll notice that the largest decline was for kindergarten, where enrollment dropped by almost 10%, compared to an average drop of 3 to 4% in other elementary schools shown in green, and for middle schools shown by the orange line. And we see almost no decline in the enrollment trend for high schools. This squares well with what we know in the aggregate for the US, where we see a 3% drop in overall enrollment in US public schools and the largest drop among kindergarten of around 13% on average. Next slide, please. We dig a bit deeper into the Michigan data. The blue bars here represent the exit rates for students across grades in the years prior to the pandemic. And the red bars represent the exit rates for these grades in fall of 2020, which is the year of the pandemic. And if you notice, for grades K through 8, the average enrollment rate in the years prior to the pandemic was averaging around 4% for each of these grades, and it jumped, and these exit rates jumped substantially in fall of 2020. For example, for students who were kindergartners in March of 2020 when the pandemic hit and were to return as first graders in fall of 2020, these exit rates almost doubled from around 4.1% in the prior years to 7.8% in the year of the pandemic. And the second thing to notice is this very smooth age gradient that we see, where exit rates are higher for younger grades, and they get smaller and smaller as we move to higher grades. So where are all these students going who are leaving the Michigan public school system? Our analysis shows that more than half of them are electing to opt for homeschooling instead. And this squares well with what we find in our national analysis, where homeschooling rates increased from 4.5% in months prior to the pandemic to 7.3% in fall of 2020, particularly among young students. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go deep into the analysis of by race and income, but I will note that we find important differences by race and by income as well. For example, when we look at drops in kindergarten, the highest drops are among Black students and among students coming from low-income families, whereas when we look at drops for higher grades, the highest drops are among white students and among students who do not belong to families who are economically disadvantaged. And with this, I will hand over to Andrew, who will talk about how the modality of instruction offered by schools affects these exit rates.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tareena. You can move to the next slide. Oh, great. Perfect. So I'll be using data coming from the US Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey to provide some information on the link between homeschooling rates and learning modality. And the learning modality comes from a company called Burbio. In the chart that's presented here, each dot represents a state, and the size of the dot is related to the number of students in each state. So larger dots correspond to states with more students in them. And so what we see is that there's a positive relationship between homeschooling rates during the pandemic and the fraction of schools in that state that are offering in-person or hybrid learning. So in other words, when fully remote instruction is not an option in a state, we found that there were larger increases in homeschooling across those states. So just for example, if we look all the way to the left of this scatter plot, these are the states that have very few in-person or hybrid options during the pandemic, at least in the early stages of the pandemic. All the data for this chart comes from the fall of 2020. And so these are states that essentially at that point in time were entirely remote. And in those states, we find that homeschooling rates increased during the pandemic by a little over 1 percentage point. By contrast, if you move to the right in this chart, these are states that were largely offering in-person or hybrid instruction in fall of 2020. And at that time, we found that homeschooling rates in these states increased by more than 4 percentage points. So a much larger increase in these states relative to the ones that were essentially entirely remote. So while homeschooling has increased in every corner of the country during the pandemic, we find that the increases were much larger in areas that offered in-person instruction. We don't have data on the underlying reasons for this pattern, but one hypothesis is that families with particular health concerns, either about their children or about others in the family, they may have been driven to seek out alternatives to the public sector when those schools did not offer remote options. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to speak to the second half of the bullets presented on this slide and not present another chart on them. But we use data from Michigan to examine movement to private schools. And what's interesting is we find the exact opposite pattern that we saw for movement to homeschool In other words, we find that private school enrollments increased in areas predominantly offering remote schooling. Now, one hypothesis for why this might be the case is that private schools were often more likely to offer in-person instruction. So it could be that families have opted out of the public education system for in-person alternatives that were offered by private schools when the public schools were offering remote instruction. One of the key takeaways, I think, from this analysis is that families were likely to choose some alternatives regardless of the choice that the public sector was making. So no matter whether the public sector offered in-person or remote learning, it was likely to push some families to seek alternatives either in the form of homeschools or private schools. And you can move to the next slide. So when we put all of this together and think about the implications of the results that I just presented along with those that Tareena started with, I think there are really three things to consider. First, has to do with funding. And so to the extent that a large percentage of students remain enrolled in alternative sectors, public school systems are likely going to face either unprecedented drops or large shifts in funding. This has particular equity concerns because the enrollment drops that Tareena was talking about are largely concentrated among elementary schools and schools serving low income and Black students. So these funding challenges could certainly present additional equity consequences. The second, there are going to be organizational challenges. So for example, if students begin to shift back to the public school sector, especially if they do it in large numbers, it could cause unplanned shifts in cohort size that might require the public education system to be a little bit more nimble. So one example of this, typically the way that that rosters and that staffing decisions are made, in many cases, is looking at enrollments in the prior grade in the prior year. So if we look at kindergarten enrollments in the prior year, it may no longer be such a great predictor of first grade enrollments in the following year. So this may require school leaders to be increasingly nimble and thinking about designing classroom rosters and ensuring that there are enough teachers who are on staff to be able to meet the demand. And the last implication that I'll speak about has to do with learning. And this really depends on the quality of the alternative to the public sector that students are receiving either in homeschooling or in private schooling. And I think the jury is still out on what we can learn about this. But one concern I have is that there's been a lot of evidence coming out showing that there's been a disproportionate, not only educational, but economic, social, health effect of the pandemic on historically disadvantaged communities. And this suggests that these enrollment trends that we're seeing could predict a widening of existing achievement gaps in future years. And I will end there, and I think we're holding off on questions until after the next round of presentations. So I'll turn it over to, I believe, Josh and Jen.
Great. Thanks so much, Andrew and Tareena. I'm going to jump in to do some intros to transition us. I can't wait to engage more with those findings with the panel and with the participants in this session. But first, yes, we want to hear from Jennifer Greif Green and Joshua Goodman. Jennifer is an associate professor in special education and a child clinical psychologist. She completed her doctorate at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and trained at Yale School of Medicine and in the Department of Healthcare Policy at Harvard Medical School. Her research focuses on supporting students with emotional and behavioral disorders and bullying prevention. She is paired with Joshua Goodman, who is an associate professor of education and economics at Boston University, where he works as an applied microeconomist on labor economics and education policy. This paper that they're going to be presenting briefly today and presentation reflects an important collaboration, one that leverages the expertise of large-scale quantitative analyses alongside deep content expertise around student mental health and bullying in schools. Working together, Josh and Jen, along with their co-authors, who you can see captured on this slide, have helped to provide new and more immediate insights into the trends around bullying in schools. Josh and Jen, take it away.
Thanks so much, Heather. Jen, if you're out there, come onto the camera. Anyway, oh, there you are. Hey, well, we're thrilled to be here to talk about maybe the rare silver lining in an otherwise pretty grim year and a half of news for students in schools. If we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. So background here, which I don't have to rehash too much, is that COVID obviously forced a huge shift to remote learning across the United States, particularly in the spring of 2020, but also in many schools in the fall of 2020 that still remained remote. There were big concerns at the time that making kids spend much more time online than they otherwise would have had the potential to increase their exposure to cyberbullying. And so that's a hard hypothesis to test, in part because data on both school bullying and cyberbullying is hard to come by, particularly with any sort of in real time, with any sort of current data. And so what we're going to do in this paper is take advantage of a data source that we've used in prior work, which is internet search data from Google Trends. You right now can type in trends.google.com and actually take a look at sort of search volume, or really search intensity, they call it, for various terms that people are looking for. And the idea in this paper is that we actually use the extent to which people are looking for phrases like search bullying or school bullying or cyberbullying on the internet as a proxy for how much actual school bullying and cyberbullying is going on. And we do a lot of work to show that internet search data in some sense can be validated before the pandemic, that it really does relate to actual levels of bullying. But what I want to tell you here is that the results we found are really striking, that before the pandemic occurred, you can sort of see in these pictures the sort of irregular rhythm to the amount of search going on for phrases like school bullying or cyberbullying as part of people's search behavior. And you can see that that kind of search drops off in the summer times when schools are out of session, and then it rises and sort of stays pretty steady during the school year, pre-pandemic. So bullying related search closely follows the school calendar. But when COVID hits in March of 2020, where that dashed line is in both of these graphs, we see historically unprecedented drops in search intensity for both search terms related to school bullying and cyberbullying. In other words, for that time of year in the spring of 2020, the amount of search going on for those terms was much lower than we'd have expected at that same time of year in prior school years. And the magnitude of these searches suggests that total bullying search drops of about 30%, again, driven mostly by changes during the school year. In the summertime, it sort of reverts to its previously low levels. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so one striking fact we wanted to ask is sort of to get at mechanisms, what's driving this drop in school and cyberbullying. So it's already somewhat surprising that both of these things are dropping, or at least that the cyberbullying part was dropping. And one obvious hypothesis is that literally physically being out of school is an important part of this story. So, it may be that the pandemic broadly was responsible for some of the trends we're seeing, but the question is, to what extent was the actual closure of schools part of this? And so we again took data similar to what Andrew was talking about in the last presentation on the extent to which a given state had open versus remote, in-person versus remote schooling. And what we saw was a very clear connection that states where there was a higher percentage of fully remote schooling, that's schools to the right in this picture, had lower levels of search intensity for all kinds of bullying, school bullying and cyberbullying in the fall of 2020. So this is once the new school year has started, states differed very much in the extent to which they went back in person versus remained remote. And so we see that search for bullying is much higher is lower in states with more virtual instruction and higher in states that are returning to in-person instruction. So bullying is reverting closer to pre-pandemic levels when schools are reopening more. And so our estimates imply that if no schools had offered in-person instruction in this new school year of 2020-21, bullying would have dropped by over 50%, which is an interesting sort of potential silver lining to the pandemic. But I'm not going to I'm going to leave the implications of what does this actually mean? What can we take away from policy beyond just, if we shut down schools, it's good for this particular negative behavior. And I'll leave this to Jen to talk about what we think we've actually learned from this. So if we could go to the next slide, that'd be great.
Thanks, Josh. So the first thing I wanted to highlight was that our study isn't the only one to find a decrease in bullying and cyberbullying during the pandemic. There's another study that was published recently using survey data from Canada that has a similar finding, that there are decreases during the pandemic in both bullying and cyberbullying. And this was interesting to us because, as Josh alluded to, there was a lot of discussion in the media and in schools about the possibility that cyberbullying would increase. And finding here that it did not increase is actually consistent with a number of other prior studies from pre-pandemic that have found that cyberbullying is an extension of in-person bullying. So what other studies have found is that many of the same students who are involved in in-person bullying are also the students who are involved in cyberbullying, rather than it being a different subset of students. And therefore, when we decrease in-person bullying, we also see a decrease in cyberbullying. So our study doesn't tell us what the reasons are for this decrease, but we have a number of hypotheses. Our first is that, as Josh mentioned, that less contact overall between peers, it probably led to a decrease in both bullying and cyberbullying. And we know that there was less contact in the past year and a half because of remote schooling and because of the pandemic. And then second, we know from prior studies that bullying is highest in places where there is unstructured interactions between students and where there's less teacher and adult monitoring. So prior studies have found that bullying is most likely to occur in settings like the cafeteria and during passing periods in the hallway and during recess, when students are interacting more fluidly and there are fewer adults and teachers around. So here we think that might be similar to the finding here, in that there were fewer unstructured and unmonitored moments. Even when schools were back in person, there were more requirements that students stayed distanced from each other. And in many schools, there was more oversight from teachers in terms of how students were interacting in person. And the same thing was happening virtually, where even though students were interacting online with each other, teachers were often highly involved in those online interactions and monitoring the discussions and chats. And then finally, we have seen in the media and in discussions among mental health providers that there's an increased interest and responsiveness in students' social and emotional well-being and students' mental health during the pandemic, and increased interest in how to support students' social and emotional well-being in schools. And so one possible mechanism is that with this increased responsiveness, students were less likely to engage in bullying, and teachers and other adults may have been more aware of bullying when it happened and more likely to intervene. So I know that Josh mentioned that one of the outcomes might be that less in-person time or less interaction in school leads to decreased bullying, and that's certainly the case. But I think an interesting discussion point for us to have today is what that means for us moving forward, because certainly from a social emotional development perspective, we don't actually want students to be interacting less during the school day. And we know that it's important for students to have those unstructured and unmonitored moments with their peers.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jen and Josh, and thanks to the four of you for bringing us into your research and findings and questions. I now want to pivot us to welcome three incredible panelists who will react and reflect and provoke and look ahead to the future. As you'll hear, they each bring a unique mix of experiences and perspectives that are going to push our thinking on what it will take to chart a course toward a more equitable future for our students. That's really our sort of grounding focus today. So I'm going to introduce the three panelists and then provide some framing, and then we'll dive in. Keri Rodrigues is Matthew, Miles, and David's mom and was elected president of the National Parents Union in 2020. Called arguably the most successful parent organizer in education advocacy today, Her outstanding commitment to social, economic, and educational equity for children and families spans decades. Welcome, Keri. Up next, Dr. Charles Grandson became the first Chief Equity and Strategy Officer for Boston Public Schools, or BPS, in 2019. Having previously served as BPS's Chief Academic Officer, and before that, Deputy Chief Operating Officer, Dr. Grandson leverages his experiences across academics and operations to support the superintendent in the development and execution of the district-wide strategic plan. Welcome, Charles. And finally, rounding out this fine crew is Jason Glass. Jason is a third-generation Kentucky educator and has been Commissioner of Education since September of 2020. Before that, he had been Superintendent and Chief Learner of Jeffco Public Schools in Colorado since 2017. Named to the National Board for Education Science in 2016 by President Barack Obama, he has held several senior education positions in Colorado, Kentucky, and Iowa. He and his wife, Sarah, have 2 elementary-age children who attend Kentucky Public Schools. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
So collectively, we'll have about 25 minutes of discussion, and then that will be followed by continued discussion with Q&A from you in the crowd. I'll direct my questions to individual panelists, so it won't be like I'll ask a question and all 3 will answer. I'll direct my questions, but invite others on the panel and the researchers to jump in along the way with relevant insights and comments. So without further ado, I'm gonna kick it off. Charles, I'm gonna start with you, and then I'm gonna throw the same question over to you, Keri. One of the things we heard during Jen and Josh's presentation that was pretty striking to me is that some of what happened during the pandemic turned out to surprise us. It was different than what we necessarily expected going into this experience. So I'm curious, what are your pandemic surprises? In other words, in what ways is your current thinking about students' experiences in school different than your pre-pandemic thinking, or what you would have expected going into that experience? So yeah, what were your surprises? Charles, you want to start us off?
Yeah. Well, first I want to say thanks for the opportunity to be on the panel today and be with such an esteemed group. And greetings from our superintendent, Dr. Brenda Caselius, Boston Public Schools. And so it's always great to have an opportunity to reflect in this way, to stop and pause in the middle of what can often feel like chaos. So very, very much appreciate the question. And I would say that the pandemic presented many challenges and opportunities. And so one, by way of surprises, I would say, was looking at all the planning that we were doing. We were engaged in a strategic planning process. We were already putting together an equity framework in the district, requiring all our district leaders to look at the importance of making sure that they're planning with equity at the center of all their, implementation, policy, budget, the day-to-day work in schools. And we had just put some of those things together in February. March, we were in shutdown, and then we were sort of off to the races trying to figure out how to find students in many cases who we couldn't make contact with, and making sure every student had a device so that they could be connected to our educators. And I think one of the things that was surprising for me, but it shouldn't have been surprising, it was a nice surprise, is the way in which educators really jumped in and really started to actually focus on what are the inequities that we know already existed, and then how can we actually plan to make contact with students and families with that at the center of our work and our thinking, and not just from the classroom, but district leaders, school leaders as well. And I think that really saved us in the long run. And really what came out of that is our focus on, how do we address academic recovery? How do we mitigate the impact that it had on so many students in terms of disrupting their education? And what's come out of that for us is a district-wide focus on equitable literacy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Charles. And that resonates with what I have been observing in BPS schools and hearing about the incredible response in that moment. Keri, I'm going to throw it over to you with a similar question. What were some of your surprises?
Well, I want to start off by shouting out to my friends at BPS. I got my GED from Boston Public Schools in 1995. So I am a product of the Boston Public Schools in some way. But what was really interesting to us was actually being able to bring to life in very real ways what we had been shouting about and fighting about as parent activists and education justice advocates for a long time. The fact that relationships with parents, families, and communities were ineffective, were broken, needed to be fixed and repaired. That was quite clear from the beginning of the pandemic, where we had parents in Boston who were showing up at bus stops expecting buses to come by when school had already been canceled. And that came down to the fact that we had ineffective communication with parents and families. We weren't getting the right messages to the right people because, you know, a lot of what we had taken for granted and assumed was working really was not. And so all was revealed in these moments. And, you know, parents and families also had some, you know, really emotional moments realizing that we were having a failure of our public education system literally right in our living rooms. And that was not something that you could hide from. Some of our kids, not only in Boston, but across Massachusetts, were getting less than 90 minutes of live instruction with a teacher during the pandemic. And what we were actually seeing from what our kids were getting during that instruction, we were not happy with. So we then entered the promised land of being told that we had options and we had opportunities to make different choices. And parents who were horrified and frustrated and full of fear that, oh my God, what's going to happen to my kid because, you know, the public education system does not have it, started seeking advice and alternatives and talking to each other and looking for different modes of education and ways to do it themselves. And so you're seeing that bear out in a lot of numbers. We had a lot of, you know, parent and family creativity come up. We had pandemic pods, we had homeschool pods. My organization directly gave away almost $700,000 in direct grants to community centers to help facilitate remote learning. Because we were still out here, you know, trying to hold it down, trying to live, you know, trying to make sure families had a roof over our heads. But at the same time saying, like, if this is all my kid is going to get right now, it's not sufficient. We need more. And so this was a time for innovation. It was also a time for parents to really engage in not just transactional ways, but transformational ways. And what we saw from that is, you know, when you have superintendents and you have principals saying, well, only you know what's best in terms of the style or the mode of learning for your child, parents embrace that opportunity. And from that, you know, they're making different choices. They're looking critically at education and not just saying, well, you know, I have to send my kid to the local school or I have to do it this way. You know, a lot of parents had to find different options, like in-person options for different reasons. And I can tell you about mine, but a lot of parents also found that virtual learning actually helped their kids to thrive. It was a good learning environment. So I think parents actually and families and communities really stepped up to the plate, and we're going to see a transformation in education as the result of that.
Keri, that really speaks to the surprises at every level. So like in individual families, like surprises, I think, in terms of what we have options for and what our students need and where our students thrive. Your response really gets me to my next question, which I'm going to send to you, Jason. And I'm going to frame it around this notion of transactional and transformational engagement with families that Keri just teed up. So during the presentation around student enrollment, Jason, we heard about some of the ways that parents are making choices now about their students' schooling experiences. How are you thinking about maintaining engagement with families in Kentucky public schools over the next few years? So we're not exiting as far as we want to be exiting the pandemic, but how are you thinking about maintaining that engagement and moving forward? And what's been hard? Like, what are you wrestling with?
Thanks for the question, Heather. Great presentations, and thanks, Charles and Keri. I really appreciate your remarks as well. Wow. Well, as I look back over this past 18 months and then think about the research presentations that we've heard, I think there are lots of opportunities to dig into all of that data and learn from it. And then, so that's an opportunity. And there's also a lot of complexity in that data. One of the things that we saw going through this is that there was no consensus on what the right thing to do was. Especially at the beginning, no one knew what the right thing to do was. And schools were in this position where whatever choice you made, you were going to alienate and make angry some group who completely believed that there was a diametrically opposite position that the schools should have been taking. So that's one level of complexity, in that there was no consensus, and to some degree there still isn't, on what should have happened and in what order. The other complexity is that, especially in larger districts like in Boston or other areas, it wasn't monolithic how schools responded. Many districts offered a variety of different learning models. So some schools were hybrid, some schools were all in person. There were varying levels of different virus mitigation strategies that were put in place. There were varying forms of remote learning that were put in place. So even within one school district or community, you were likely to see this huge variety of different options that popped up as schools tried to think about how can we, in that lack of consensus among what our families want, how can we offer some options for families? So that, I think that's a complexity. And as we research this, is you can't look at a community like Boston or Jeffco, where I was superintendent, and say, here's how they did it, because there was a huge amount of variability in how that happened. And we saw that across the country. The other thing that happened over the course of the pandemic that I think is something to take into account in the research, and what comes to mind is Mike Tyson's great quote, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. Well, COVID just kept punching us in the face. So every couple of weeks or every month, what we knew changed, or the virus changed, or the threat of it changed. And so schools had to keep adapting their models. So we saw these school systems, either at the local level or at the school level, or even at the state level, that modulated back and forth between in-person, hybrid, remote, and back and forth, and it kept moving around. So I think that's a complexity as we dive into the research on this. The data is going to be difficult to code and think through, because you had all these different models, and things changed over the course of the pandemic. With all of that said, I think that we have to look upon this experience of the past 18 months as an opportunity to learn, but I also think we need to be cautious about what we can infer from that going forward. This was a really terrible, awful, and weird experience that we've all lived through. And we're emerging from that. And there may be some things about that experience that change the education system profoundly, importantly, and for the better going forward. And then there may be some things that we go back to the way that we were doing things before. For example, we may see a lot more students choosing homeschooling, choosing remote options, and I think that's a good thing. And I think that presents an opportunity for our public schools to think about how they can offer a variety of different learning options to support families, how we can better engage and support homeschooling families. I think those are great opportunities for public schools. But I don't think right now you can make an inference that these are trends that are going to be present forever going forward. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. But I think we have to look at the context of, we lived through this pandemic. It was a weird time. There were lots of individual societal decisions that were being made without full information. And as we exit that, we're going to have a different set of considerations. So just a note of caution on inferring from that experience into the future. So I think that, just in closing, we learned a lot. We learned about the capacities of what we could do with technology, and we sure as hell learned about the limitations of it as well, and the importance of in-person experiences. And there are opportunities going forward for us to rethink how schools create experiences for students that can keep them engaged. One last point I'll make is I have a great student advisory panel here in Kentucky made up of kids across the state. And we talked to them a lot about what they were experiencing, what they liked, what they didn't like. What we heard from them is they really missed interacting with their peers, with their teachers. They missed those personal human connections when things were all shut down and they were in remote environments. But what we also heard from them is that that experience forced schools to really structure how you get assignments, where information is, where you may think about a high school student that's going from 50-minute class to 50-minute class to 50-minute class. in this really frenetic, disconnected system, it feels like to them. Well, the pandemic forced all schools to really think about how can we deliver this in a succinct, direct way to students. They liked that. They also really liked that they had some agency. A lot of schools shifted and said, you've got some decisions to make around how you organize your time, what order you study things, how you respond to tasks and assignments. And our students told us they really liked that agency. I think those are two important things that we can carry forward as we think about emerging from this and how it can transform the learning experiences for students.
Thanks so much, Jason. And I want to sort of pause my instinct to like jump to another question and just invite explicitly invite other panelists to like jump in along the way as we're engaging this discussion, so that it doesn't feel like a frenetic 50-minute class after 50-minute class. So like cut me off and jump in to respond and react to each other, please, as we move through these. Yeah, Charles.
Go ahead. No, I wanted to just quickly add and really appreciate a lot of what Keri and Jason just shared. And I think one of the biggest lessons learned for us during the pandemic was our understanding of where educational expertise sits in the community. And thinking about education as a very sort of personal and social process, very much about the collective experience, but also ultimately it comes down to the individual student and their needs and the context they live in. And knowing this, I think, is critical for us shifting our understanding of how we operate as district and school leaders and educators. We were trained to believe that we have the expertise in everything from child psychology to curriculum to education law, but who knows their needs best, right? Students' needs best, but the learner and their families. And so one of the things that was really pivotal for us is implementing what we ended up terming as equity roundtables. And 1 week after shutdown in March of 2020, we did that weekly, and then we instituted one in every school. And it's been proven to be, for us, a really important way to stay connected to students and families, but to also center their thinking and their needs. And not to say that there isn't a place for the expertise and experiences that educators have, but starting with students and their families first.
And I just want to say, I think that's incredibly important, but we have to make sure that, you know, we're not just listening, we're also taking action. And so, you know, any kind of conversation we're having, you know, we love to box check in this work, you know, sit down, like we want to hear from parents, and then we hear stuff we don't like, and then we don't do anything about it. And that's not what this moment calls for. What we're seeing across the country, like we have the longest running national poll of parents that's actually created by parents for parents about how we feel. And by a 2-to-1 margin, parents across the board, you know, in 21 national polls have said that this is a time to reimagine education. And they have a lot of ideas about how that should happen. Because frankly, for the past 18 months, we have been the co-facilitators of education, right alongside educators every step of the way. We have a lot of information. We have a lot of data. We have a lot of thoughts about what we need to do to have an equity infused educational recovery. The fact of the matter is, like, we're right now running an accountability campaign across this country because we don't feel like we're being heard or listened to. One of the things that was brought up is the social emotional support. Parents have been saying, you know, unequivocally the past 18 months, our kids have been living in solitary confinement. They are struggling, they are depressed, they are upset. You know, we just had the data about bullying, talking about like the fact that it's decreased. You know, obviously, if you're not in person, bullying is going to decrease. And you're seeing, you know, relatively regular rates in places where school is actually in person. All of that makes sense. We shouldn't have to wait until the data comes back that our kids are fighting in classrooms, they're fighting in cafeterias, they're getting jumped a block away from school to take action when parents are now saying that we have a social emotional crisis. The ESSER, the ARP money should be invested into really addressing these issues that we're seeing. But instead, we're taking a real wait and see approach. Well, let's see what the data says. Let's wait and see. Let's do an event. Like, parents are telling you, like in very large ways, this is what we're seeing in our homes. This is what we're seeing on the block. This is what we're seeing at the bus stop. Like we've got to be responsive to this level of engagement, because it's a unique opportunity for us to really do something transformative and not do the same old, which is, you know, trying to move the Titanic and not being quick and nimble and being able to pivot to meet the needs of what kids actually need right now, because they're in a crisis at this point. And I just don't feel like as a public education system, we're being as responsive as we need to in this moment.
Thanks so much, Keri. That raises a really interesting question here around like where we have access to data and evidence and information and where we don't, and when, in order to like, I hear saying like we can't just wait for information to come to us and then make decisions. And Jason and Charles, I'm curious from the district and the state perspectives, as decision makers in your respective spaces, what kinds of decisions have you had to make that affected students' academic achievement or social emotional well-being? I would say and or social emotional well-being, as if those are separate. We know they are not. In the past 18 months, so during this pandemic time where you've been faced with a decision that you've had to make, and you didn't have access to the data or evidence or information that you wish you had access to in order to figure out what to do. Can you take us into some of those hard decisions you've had to make?
Sure, I'll start, and I'm interested to hear what Charles's thoughts are, but I think practically most of them were really difficult decisions with incomplete information. Go back to the beginning of the pandemic, when everything sort of closed down, I can remember trying to find any news article around international systems where the pandemic was a little ahead of us, and what were they doing, and what were the effects, and what are the right combination of virus mitigation. So that was spring of 2020. We had a few months in that summer, and then we had to reopen school in some form and figure out what the right way to do that was. And again, there was no scientific, medical, political consensus on what the right thing to do was. And so you had to just put it together and then go. And so I think one of the things that we should laud and appreciate about our educators is the way that we retooled instructional systems, human resource systems, allocated people, time, supports to try and meet a variety of different family needs and redesign the education system on the fly. But I can tell you that in the decisions I had to make as a superintendent and then coming into the state level, all of them that related to what's the right level of virus mitigation strategies, what are those, in what order are they deployed, how are they deployed, when is the right time to go from in-person to remote, what's the right decision on masking, all of it was made with incomplete information. All of it, we would now, if we could go back and replay the pandemic, now we know a lot more. We've seen that with the right combination of virus mitigation strategies, you can have in-person learning safely. We have seen that with the right kinds of supports and training for both parents and students and teachers, you can have quality and effective remote instruction. So I think hopefully we won't have to live through anything like this again, but we've learned a lot, and I wish I could go back and replay some of those decisions with the information that I have now.
Yeah, I'll double click on what Jason said. I think two that come to mind in terms of decisions that we had to make. One is, the decision, we thought, our superintendent often says that she looks at her education career and thought that the hardest decision she'd ever have to make was to, shut down schools and go to remote learning in the spring of 2020. And only to find it was even more difficult to decide when to reopen, how to reopen that fall. And I think we went through a series of sort of back and forth looking at and partnering with our city hall and our city health agencies, the state agencies, and having conflicting information, even in those cases, having information and guidance from CDC that sometimes conflicted with what the state education agency provided. And I think those kind of challenges, I think sometimes there was information and not the right information, or not knowing which information to go with. And then having that conversation with members of the community, especially teachers unions and other collective bargaining units, as well as families. And then one that I think about is a crossroads we came to in terms of deciding whether or not we would continue to require our internal assessments to know where students were, right? Because of all the things we're focusing on, social emotional health and health overall, but also making sure that we weren't further exacerbating or doing everything that we could to not further exacerbate the opportunity and achievement gaps that we've been, working on for years in our community. And one of the ways of knowing where students are is providing those interim assessments, right? And so a decision to pause that based on everything that was happening was a hard one that we had to make during that time. And, it's one of those ones where you're not sure if you're making the right decision. And you know that later on, when you want to know how students were doing, it's going to be impossible to have something concrete to explain that. And so I go back to, I think, one of the things that saved us in building on Keri's point, the accountability around when you do get input from students and families, how do we know that you actually followed through? And where is that accountability point? And that's what we built in with our equity roundtable. And so, it was contentious because we put an accountability mechanism in for ourselves. And often weekly, we were getting really, really hard feedback as we deserved, because where we didn't follow through, we were there facing, right, the community and students and families in terms of what we were trying to accomplish.
And can I jump in on this really quick? And I can appreciate like how difficult these decisions were, and in talking with parents and families again across the country throughout the pandemic, one of the things that I think state chiefs and superintendents and principals failed to understand is that parents and families really weren't looking for you to make these decisions. They were looking for public health officials to make these decisions. They were looking for doctors, scientists to make these decisions. And what we tried to do is make it really clear that doctors and scientists and public health officials felt should be making the calls around these things, around school reopening. You're not epidemiologists. Parents and families did not trust you to make, these COVID mitigation strategies and plans and whatnot, because your expertise is around education and not epidemiology. And so a lot of this situation that we're in right now, which is a crisis with parents and families and educators and education systems, there's a lack of trust, and there's been an erosion in that relationship that we're not acknowledging because of some of these missteps, because we saw people in many areas making decisions that weren't based on science. We saw in some areas where people were reopening schools and trusting the science and social distancing and masking, and some folks that weren't reopening schools because it was quite clear that they were in a political fight. And now, because parents' eyes have been opened and we can see, oh, wait, some of these decisions were not based on what's best for kids and not based on science, and it was based on politics and union negotiations and everything else. They're feeling angry, concerned, worried, wanting to hold people accountable and really have some tough conversations because they don't know who to trust. And I think what we haven't done in this moment is really acknowledge that deep fracture that's happened, which is why we're seeing a lot of the chaos that we're seeing in a lot of our political conversations around education right now.
I'd like to jump in and respond to that just briefly. I respectfully, Keri, I do think that it oversimplifies the issue to say that superintendents and state chiefs were just making decisions in absence of public health or scientific guidance. That wasn't my experience. I was on the phone daily, sometimes multiple times a day with our public health officials. And I think it's safe to say that public health officials, doctors, scientists, at the beginning of this, they weren't sure what the right things to do were. So we weren't getting complete or direct information from them. And I also I think we haven't seen sort of this trust of expertise in the medical profession. We even see states that are rolling back the ability of their public health officials to control pandemics because there's an erosion of trust and belief that the CDC or other public health officials are making good decisions when it comes to churches or restaurants or schools. So as much as I think we would like to look back and say all of this was based on science and what's best for kids, it was politicized. And there was a lack of consensus even among the medical community around what the right thing to do was.
Great, thanks so much for layering in all the complexity here. This is where I think multiple voices makes for a powerful conversation. I'm going to ask one more and sort of recenter us in the research presentations, and then I'm going to turn to some questions from the Q&A section, which please continue to add to those. This goes to anyone who wants to jump in, but having heard some of the research findings that were shared on the front end of this session, are there unanswered questions for you from those presentations and topics more generally? Or another way to think about that is, what is the next set of questions you'd encourage them to look into moving forward? So I'll open that up to whoever wants to kick us off. And welcome back to our research teams.
I'll just jump in very quickly. I think Keri touched on a really important element of this, in that a lot of these decisions were politicized. And so where you saw decisions being made in urban, liberal areas, there was one set of decisions being made that was prioritizing the values of those communities and sometimes the values of how we lift up and prioritize the safety of the staff over what maybe was in the best interest of the students. So that happening and that was happening. Then you have rural conservative areas where the complete opposite was happening, where there were arguments around, should we believe this is occurring at all? Should we have any virus mitigation? And let's get everybody back in school and pretend this isn't occurring. So I think as the research unfolds, that's an important layer of this to put in, is what are sort of the politics in the community that unfortunately were hyper partisan. They were left-right politics, and there was little sort of consensus around, and still little consensus around what the right thing to do is. But that's a variable here in how decisions were made, is the politics of the community and the hyper partisan nature in which all these decisions were made.
I would just quickly add to that. I think the psychological impact on this cohort of students who've had, now going on 3 years of disrupted education in the traditional sense that we understand it and have done it. And so I think about daily, just think about my own son, 5 years old, who spent a lot of time with me daily, and still to this day, even though he's back in school, we just ask, can't we just stay home like we did last year? And so, I think about his excitement and interest in walking into a school building every morning, and how long that's going to continue to have an impact on him, and how it's going to show up in school and his learning experience and the learning process, and ultimately learning outcomes for him and his peers. And so that's something that I'm definitely interested in learning more about over time.
I mean, there's a ton that I'm interested in, specifically around the social emotional issues that our kids are going through right now. I think what Charles was saying is right on point. I mean, we've had a period of significant unfinished learning happening, and what the long-term impact is going to be on those kids. That's our work right now. That's why when we talk about data, often I'm talking about assessment and evaluation and all of that. And to me, that data and that information that we have around students right now is critically important. I don't take my kid to a pediatrician that doesn't use a diagnostic assessment to determine how sick he is and whether or not he needs medicine, and for how long, and what the dosage is, and everything else. I don't want my kids walking into school buildings where we're not doing a diagnostic assessment of their educational health, and we're not setting up a plan and a pathway for how we're going to deal with unfinished learning and get these kids on to a trajectory of opportunity. Because saying that, oh gosh, these kids have been through a pandemic and giving them, pandemic stamped diplomas or giving them a little asterisk, that's not the key. They're not going to be given a pass when they're trying to get a job or when they're trying to complete college or anything else. So we're not doing our kids a favor by turning a blind eye and not collecting data and not saying like, this is what we need. This is where your kid is right now. This is where we're trying to get them to be. And really the door to opening that is really addressing the social emotional crisis that we're dealing with right now, because our kids right now being able to access academics is difficult. And there's a whole host of issues. I mean, the priorities of parents right now, we half of us can't get our kids into the classroom because we have a transportation crisis, because Amazon is paying more than the bus companies are. We can't get our kids to school in some portions of the country. We can't depend that the bus route is actually going to be coming on time so we can actually make sure we can run our families correctly. So there's a whole host of issues, but I think first and foremost, we have to make sure, are the kids okay? And collecting data and information around where kids are right now, how many fights are happening, what kind of disciplinary action is happening, because poor Black and brown kids are always disproportionately impacted by discipline, and it's going to be happening again. Addressing that first and foremost is paramount to me.
Thanks to all three of you. Research teams, I hope you'll jump in as we transition to some Q&A from the audience, but also to sort of draw back on conversations that have happened up to this point. I'm actually going to start with a question in the Q&A area, if you will. I think everyone has access to that and is able to see it. And Jason, you jumped in with a response, but I want to surface it for the rest of the group, because I think it gets at this idea of back to this question of like, what is surprising us and where do we go from here? So have any of you, and this goes to panelists or presenters, seen any other unexpected consequences of the pandemic outside of perceived reduction in bullying, cyberbullying, which we got to hear quite a bit about, or increased homeschooling or private school enrollment, that have surprised you or that are not receiving as much attention? I'm going to focus, we talked a little bit about the surprises, like what's not receiving as much attention as you believe they should be in this moment. So for John, this is increases in chronic absenteeism, especially among students with disabilities who rely on school-based services, and difficulties incentivizing students to attend classes remotely are pretty striking to him. So, what are the areas that aren't receiving as much attention right now in your opinions? And again, I'll open that to the panel and to the presenters.
Just to touch base quickly on the finding around the decrease in bullying, cyberbullying. I think the researcher said this, but again, I will say it again, be cautious about inference from that, because we're in a really unusual time, a really unusual set of circumstances. And what probably happened is that, bullying is a form of sort of intolerance toward some other, what you perceive to be some different group or perceived trait. And so when you don't have to be around it, you don't have to tolerate it. And so you see intolerance. I think bullying is a form of intolerance, and it's also a form of power. So you don't have proximal sort of area or to bully someone. So as we come back into in-person learning, I don't know that we've addressed power or intolerance with our students profoundly during this pandemic. We may see that this all come back to the levels that it was before. So be careful about inference from this pandemic experience into the future and what we think that means. I think as I noted here, on the positive side, we're seeing an explosion of different educational options for kids. That's great. And I hope that continues, because it's good for families, it's good for students, and I think it will be good for our education system. But we're also seeing, while we've got this increased public interest in education, it's often just hyper politicized talking points, like this whole critical race theory war that's happening out and all the arguments around that, where nobody is really getting into the details of what critical race theory is or isn't, how it appears or doesn't appear in school. It's just kind of this talking point in around the whole equity, diversity, and inclusion discussion.
Thanks, Jason. Who else? I want to keep this question open for another moment. What's not receiving as much attention right now?
I'll throw out the part of the motivation for the bullying paper was that I was seeing news stories with anecdotes so that, in general, remote learning for most students was a total disaster in a lot of ways. But then you'd see once in a while a story about a student for whom a parent would say, you know what, being at home, my kid is actually really starting to blossom. And you'd say, well, what? Like that's unusual. And you'd sort of dig in a little bit and they say, no, my kid has social anxiety or was having a tough time, with peers in some other way. And so I think, I hope that going forward, we pay a little bit of attention to the fact that, by the nature of what schools are, there's a mass production aspect to what we do. As I've been a high school teacher, I'm a college teacher now, you sort of have to do things for a group of people, but the pandemic made clear that there's a lot of heterogeneity. Kids can be really different. And for many of them, the remote learning thing doesn't work well, but for some of them, it actually did. And so I think it raises tough questions about, are there lessons we can take away about sort of the way in which some kids respond to different models of education better? And can we incorporate that into the classroom in a way that doesn't, dramatically overburden schools and teachers who, have a lot to deal with already?
I think that's super important. And, anecdotally, I'm seeing this with my own kids in my own house. I will tell you that 86% of American families have said that they want individualized education plans for their kids because they don't want to put their kids back in the status quo box that frankly was not really working that well before the pandemic. And so they're really interested in an individualized approach. Like I will tell you, between myself and my fiance, we have 5 little boys in this house, between 8 and almost 14, between 3rd grade and 8th grade. 2 of my kids, after February vacation last year, I had to pull them out of the traditional public school where they have been doing Zoom because my 9-year-old had gained 40 pounds and it was a Monday morning and he was sobbing his eyes out because he hated his life and could not do Zoom one more day. I picked up the phone, I called a Catholic school because I needed to save my kid. And I was very concerned about my youngest as well. So that was like literally real-time conversation or real-time decision that I had to make right then. I will tell you this morning, my kid who thrived in a Zoom environment, I spent about 35 minutes with him this morning before he would enter the school building again, because he feels like the weird kid and nobody likes him and nobody wants to be his friend. And he's gone back to and actually regressed in his growth and his educational experience because of some social issues that he's feeling right now. So I think we've learned a lot about our kids. And as a parent, like it gives me pause to say like, wow, now I'm putting him back into an educational environment that before the pandemic was not really working very well for him. Maybe a virtual style of education is something we should look at. Maybe there should be some modification there. But I think there's a lot for us to learn.
Just quickly pick up on many of the points that Keri just raised. I think, I mean, we're all living it. My son did not want to walk in there this morning into the building. The look on his face, he just did not want to do it. And I think about one of the unexpected sort of consequences for us, which really we should have expected and probably did. But looking at this just staggering numbers, the large percentages of students, especially across our high schools, are chronic absenteeism. And we think about how families, communities, students shifted their lives to make the pandemic work in that context, in that moment, right? Many students went to work full time. If they already weren't working full time, they picked up even more shifts, right? And the national and worldwide labor shortage, right? Who are they looking for, right? Our students who are in high schools and who want to be able to provide for and contribute to their families. And also struggling to complete their education. And so as we look at all the other things we've talked about with the pandemic, I think, it's very much the things that we are struggling with overall in society. Our students and their families are impacted by it and continue to be.
I'll just chime in my anecdotally to my second grader who didn't speak in school really at all, started chatting on the chat when he was learning remotely and was participating in new ways. So I agree. I think that both how students can engage in new ways, and also hearing from schools about parents who are able to attend IEP meetings and parents who are able to meet with teachers who, because of their work schedule and because of their lives previously, weren't able to engage, and this has provided new opportunities. And Keri, to your point, students sometimes having greater access to health services and to behavioral health or mental health services because they're able to access the services either remotely, or specialists who are not located directly in their community who otherwise they would not have access to. So I think that those are potential growth opportunities. And then I also, Jason, wanted to come back to something you said earlier, which is your point about bullying being about power difference. And I think the other thing we know about bullying is that bullying typically occurs because it serves a function for the student who's enacting the bullying. And many times that function is related to increasing their social prestige or their popularity within a school setting. And I think that I saw the question about qualitative methods and mixed methods. I think that could be a really important area for us to explore further and to understand how social dynamics and popularity shifted and changed in the context of the pandemic, and to what extent those social relationships and interactions will or will not return to what they looked like before.
And it's just the trauma of it, right? You think about it, as parents, as human beings, like there was a portion of the pandemic where we were told to be afraid of people walking down the street. I told my little boys, when we saw somebody coming, we had to cross the street. We had to be far away, and you should be afraid because you don't know if they have the coronavirus. Like our kids took that into their hearts. And now all of a sudden we're like, no, it's okay. Like go into a big room with lots of people. There's trauma associated with what just happened, not just for that, but a lot of us lost parents and grandparents and loved ones and people in our community. And so they're struggling a lot with that as well. So understanding that, just shoving them back into what works, because it's what's easy for us to manufacture educationally. Like our kids are going to manifest these behaviors in bullying or acting out or fighting. Like these are little human beings. These are children that we're talking about, and they don't have the coping strategies. And frankly, reteaching them a lot of the things that they've now been taught at a very early age is something we have to acknowledge.
I am tasked now with the hardest part of facilitating these sorts of things, which is wrapping us up. But I think that last exchange was a powerful one in terms of the complexity of these choices that we're making, how things vary from kid to kid. Anyway, I want to express great gratitude to everyone on the screen here. For your engagement today, for your provocations and your reflections. We had a far-ranging discussion. I'm going to flag a few things that I heard. I heard about nice surprises and also really hard decisions. I heard about the layered challenges of a constantly shifting landscape with varying degrees of access to information and evidence and no consensus. Jason, you flagged that. Like there has been no consensus, and how hard that can be, and the role of politics in those realities as an important piece. We heard about wildly different needs from student to student. I really appreciate folks bringing in, the experiences that you had this morning with your young people, and also family to family, and how we can create options to meet those needs better and based on what we are learning and seeing. The need for transactional and transformational engagement of parents and families to continue that work. And I also heard a collective commitment to reimagining in the midst of all of these pieces. So with tremendous amounts of gratitude, I'm gonna wrap us up for today and invite everyone to join us for a final session of the day. To do that, remember, you had to leave the main session and come to this breakout. So you'll need to leave this breakout or leave this Zoom room and rejoin the main Zoom feed that came with your original invite or your original link. And that closing panel will begin at 1. So you'll have a half an hour to go grab some lunch, take a walk, whatever time zone you're in, do what makes sense. check your email, do some work. And whereas this breakout discussion had a specific focus on students, the afternoon session is going to be a more overarching reflection and discussion around the questions and challenges we should be ready to address heading into the future. And if you don't plan to join us for the last session, thanks so much for participating in today's event. And early next week, you'll receive an email with a link to an event recording of today's sessions, so the morning, the breakouts, and the afternoon, as well as some post-event materials, again, incorporating comments that we have heard through chats and Q&As. And apologies to the questions we didn't get to address, but great thanks for the ones that we did, and look forward to continuing these conversations in other spaces with all of you. Thanks so much.